All right, so we are now, I guess, in the final section of this discussion, and uh, kind of the technical numbers on the clock are everyone has 2 minutes to do a sort of final wrap up. And we can either do that in sequence again, or we can do it kind of more as a conversation. Do you guys have a preference? No? Um, okay, well, yeah, well, who wants to maybe go first? Like, what's the last thing that you would say? Or maybe to kind of jump off of Phil's point, like, what would collective action look like in the sphere that you were talking about? Or, yeah, Sergio.
I just want to jump in on Phil's point because I this idea of the status quo is one that I think about often when we think about our immigration system, and we think the term that's often used when we use terms like immigration reform is that the immigration system is broken in the United States, and of course the reality is that the immigration system works just fine for a very select number of people in this country, which are the employers who recruit these workers, and then a large majority of Americans who are very comfortable with not thinking about these questions. If we think about the way in which we have to reframe this conversation, I think it goes to that point. And the way I think we see this is, even though we think that there's kind of like a polarity in this country in terms of political understandings of immigration that one party supports and another doesn't, it's often much more complicated than that. And I think Wisconsin is a perfect place to see that, right? So we see Senator Ron Johnson, who ostensibly would be opposed to immigration and often does vilify undocumented immigrants, but is one of the largest supporters for expanded guest worker programs in the state of Wisconsin. Because all people in the state as well across the United States understand that immigrants are essential not only for work, but also for filling up demographic holes across our country. And so in those rural parts of the state that have been experiencing a decline in demographics and specifically in white communities, it has been Latinx communities, Latinx families, and Latinx workers that have filled those spaces. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time in thinking about policy solutions because I think those are clear and they're out there. I want us to keep becoming uncomfortable with the idea that the status quo is broken, right? That we're in some sort of crisis. And the reality is for Latinx families and Latinx workers, this has been the status quo for 100 years. The crisis has been here for a very long time. And to get to the point about, back to the beginning of our conversation that Melissa started us off with this idea of euphemisms. I mean, we need to deconstruct these euphemisms and to learn to be very uncomfortable when we use this type of language because it just allows us to refuse to talk about the real issues at hand.
Yeah, again, here. Absolutely. Does anyone want to jump in on that? Yeah, Jill?
Yeah, I think you raise a really interesting point, which is correct and accurate. The last 2 years and even a little bit longer is as if people have discovered that we have problems in the United States, right? These are hundreds of years along problems and years of problems in healthcare and years of problems with racism and years of problems with sin. And as if somehow we've discovered this and now we're going to go fix it when we're not really wrestling with the really, really hard issues in all of those areas. For me, and Melissa has brought up the anxiety and the mental health, particularly of our younger generations. But they are a younger generation that are having conversations in different ways than at least I did when I was young. And I think those are the conversations that we need to support and foster and help, because I think that's where some of this change is actually going to come from.
I'll take that from there. That's where a lot of my interest lies as well, both as an educator, and as a parent, as an employee, and so on. But really thinking about young people and thinking about the workforce in a very specific way for what I'm thinking here, that is in our capacity as knowers. And so for me, a lot of this has to do with kind of big picture warding off, there's nothing I could do because it's all messed up. Therefore, right? And like this numbness. And I think that that really threatens in the background, even of young people, you know, hosting coffee houses next week about what's going on in Ukraine and so on. They're doing these good things, but I think that that threat of numbness, especially coming out of 2 years of the pandemic, is really there. And so my question is always, how can I help young people, and kind of as a reminder to myself as not so young, you know, that you have a right to your ideas and that your ideas have value and that it's okay to make mistakes and not know it all the time. Because I think any kind of future we have, and I don't think this is a naive or uncritical view, but any kind of future we have is going to depend on that, and making sure that we don't just completely give up on trying to do something in some ways. You know, if anyone here on this call were to completely give up, we would literally not be in our jobs because we'd be going and making a lot more money elsewhere, right? Like, but we're kind of in it and we're staked in it, I think. But it's this idea that your ideas have value, that people on the margins, women, non-white people, people long marginalized from intellectual life, that they have a right to these conversations, that we all benefit from the knowledge that they bring. That for me is where a lot of my interest lies in these conversations, and just letting them know that even if so much of this is hopeless, it's still worth working at. And that has its own long history in labor movements as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a theme here. I mean, there's actually a few themes running in this conversation, and maybe could pick up on a few more of them. But I think one of them is the way that during the pandemic, and certainly for years before, that a lot of these important questions about, you know, exactly how to avoid some of these like outcomes that were pretty awful from an objective standpoint, like before the pandemic, a lot of those questions are obscured and can't even necessarily be asked because of the way that work, the way that occupational status, the way that immigration status is used instrumentally by people who have power to divide us and prevent us from working together, from taking collective action together. And I think that's certainly, like, that hasn't changed at all during the pandemic. But there has been something that has come to light as a new way. There are always new ways to divide us, right? Because they're always figuring out that, oh, actually, workers do end up being able to take collective action once in a while. And that's sort of frightening. So there are always new ways. And I think one of them is actually our health conditions themselves. If you think about the pandemic itself and the way that because of the way that health is treated hegemonically as an individual experience, even though health is profoundly and fundamentally collective, but the role, like individualization of health has a profound function in dividing us, because it says to us that the way that you experience crises, big or small, is really your problem, and nobody else's. And that difference can be really easily instrumentalized by politicians or employers to divide workers, individualize risk, to create tension over what it means to return to normal by, for example, pitting our personal conveniences against somebody else's safety. Right? That very thing is an example of the way that that fiction of individual health can be used to drive a wedge between us and actually separate us. But it doesn't just separate us on those issues of, like, should you wear the mask? Should you not wear the mask? That's where we are at Marquette right now, obviously. But it also has a way of turning our attention away from the policy changes that, were we to enact them, would actually make us all better off, regardless of whether or not we have comorbidities or we're immunocompromised or whatever, right? It turns us away from thinking about paid sick leave. It turns us away from thinking about the fact that our, premiums and cost sharing go up every year, and that's true in the national employer benefits surveys that Kaiser Health Kaiser Family Foundation does. Like, we know that, right? But as long as we're focused on, oh, my health is really based on my choices, and that by making myself well and imbibing wellness, right, as this individualized kind of fiction, I'm going to make myself well, and the people to blame for my higher costs or, worse health conditions are those other irresponsible people. Well, you see, we all lose, I think, when that's the case.
Absolutely. Just was writing down in my notes, decision fatigue as a weapon of necropolitic capitalism, potentially. So, um, yeah, I think we're a couple of minutes before like the time we're supposed to turn to YouTube questions. But I feel like that was a kind of good concluding moment. So can we turn to the folks who are attending on the live stream? And Jorge, you're going to ask some questions, and then I don't think I need to specifically direct them to people. I trust all of our panelists to jump in when they feel like they have a response to a question. But would you be able to read some of the questions in the live chat?
Sure. We have a couple of comments. Valerie Lynch says, my mom is a high school teacher with students with immigrant parents working meatpacking. At one point, her students' parents got COVID and they had to miss class to work to support their families. This is, I think, responding to what Dr. Gonzalez was talking about. Amber Wichowski says, exclusion of immigrants from the social safety net has a long history. And we have a couple of questions from one from Dr. Kim, and I can also formulate a question myself, but if you broadly want to respond to this, perhaps Dr. Gonzalez or somebody else.
Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate that comment, the individual sharing that experience from their own life here. The point that I would make here is that we often think of this term of mixed status family when we think about documentation status, but the reality, of course, is that mixed status family can also apply within Latinx and undocumented families when you think about the downstream effects. So these children, of course, are not going to work in meatpacking. It's not the case of the migrant farm workers in Wisconsin in the 1950s and 60s who were actually out in the fields with their parents and who were being affected by pesticides and who were working, 14-hour days. But here, of course, the consequences of their parents being forced to work in these unsafe conditions where they're going to contract COVID and then bring it home to the rest of their family is pretty clear, right? And so to Phil's point about the ability of some people to individualize and then the inability of others to even have that option, right? And we see this in kind of the explosion of the pandemic within communities of color, where often people are tightly packed within spaces and their social networks are kind of tied among other people who are working in similar conditions, right? And so when we think about this concept of mixed status, often it means more than just a person's documentation status in this country.
Dr. Kim's question goes along with I think Dr. Rocco was talking about. He says, who does the narrative of personal responsibility privilege? And I think the second part of the question goes more to Dr. Guttormson. He says, and does emphasizing the resilience of healthcare heroes serve as a pretext for violating the rights of this population? So perhaps we can start with Dr. Rocco and then move on to Dr. Guttormson.
No, I mean, I think you could think about that narrative of personal responsibility is it privileges people who, on the one hand, I think it further commodifies or reinforces the legitimacy of like the commodification of health, the treatment of health as something that one purchases, right? And so if you're, rich, you can purchase, essentially whatever, as much health as you need, right? That's sort of on the one hand what it does, but also that individualization of risk narrative, I think, privileges employers and governments, as well as the gatekeepers of health in the United States, certainly insurance companies, in the sense that it allows them to offload risk, certainly risk in monetary terms, onto the individual, right? And I think that wellness programs within workplaces are a great example of this, which is that there's very little clinical research to suggest that the wellness programs work for any number of conditions, but that hasn't stopped employers from using them because it allows them to do more cost shifting onto their employees. I mean, it's very, very easy to understand. And you can scale that up to any number of institutions that have that sort of gatekeeping function. But I really want to hear Jill talk about the heroes question. It's really important.
Yeah. So I also want to just say that individual actions have very little to do with overall health, right? I know we all know that, but I don't think we can say that enough, that there are being able to go to a doctor, being able to go to a gym, the individual action has way more to do with social determinants of health and many things that are completely out of the control of individuals. So I know we all know that, but I think it bears stating one more time. And if I'm understanding the question, Jorge, can you repeat the last part of the question for me?
I think you're muted.
Yeah, so does emphasizing the resilience of healthcare heroes serve as a pretext for violating the rights of that population?
So I think what it did, the healthcare heroes, it allowed people to put signs in the yards, and it allowed people to say, well, we're giving them food and we're bringing things. And it didn't actually address the problem, right? Which was lack of PPE, lack of personal protective equipment, lack of enough beds, lack of enough ventilators, lack of enough sleep because they were working double shifts. So it put a Band-Aid on a huge gaping hole and wound. And so it put the burden of actually doing the work on individuals to make it work without the resources to be able to do it well. And I think people had really good intentions about talking about healthcare workers as heroes, but it didn't have any substance connected to it. And in fact, some of the nurses talked about, and this of course isn't true of all hospital administrations, but they talked about feeling like they were being just forgotten and just not supported in a way, just, well, you just have to make it work. This is just what has to happen. And so I think it was well-intentioned. I think that it didn't actually put the right narrative out there about how one truly supports the workers that are caring for the community. And so in the end, I don't know that it did harm, but it certainly did not help. Yeah.
Could I jump in there really quickly just about the kind of rhetoric of like this is actually a little bit my lane as the literature scholar who heretofore has had very little to say, but I think the rhetoric of heroism is a really interesting one for the USA specifically, and particularly in a moment where our favorite movies are all 2-hour-long epics about like superheroes who can get so much shit thrown at them over and over and over again and keep getting back up. And I think that the kind of hero myth is one that the US has cultivated alongside the bootstrapping myth, which sets people up who are heroes as those who we do not need to help. They are the kind of foundational myth of the person who helps themselves and can take all of the damage and then keep going. And so by calling healthcare workers heroes, I think, Jill, you're totally right. Like it's a well-intentioned gesture, but what it's actually saying is we expect you to be able to do this on your own, and we fault you for asking for help because none of the good Marvel heroes ever really ask for help. They just get back up and then win the fight. And, I think that kind of our obsession with heroism is also interesting when we consider the kinds of collective action which do lead to real change. If we have the kind of myth of the singular hero who gets stuff done, then people aren't going to be seeing their ideal as people banding together to kind of fight for their rights. And there's a weird way in which the kind of hero figure is simultaneously, this icon in American society, but also entirely empty, because like the hero is presumed not to exist in society, to exist above or outside of society. It's weirdly the kind of like rhetorical inverse of the invisible subject, because the hero is hyper visible but also extremely empty at the same time. And the invisible subject, the impossible subject, is simply not seen. But they're both never afforded help, or kind of recognition, or one is afforded hyper recognition and the other is afforded none, but both are expected to help themselves. They wear the same bootstraps.
And this is why women are leaving the workforce in droves. They're exhausted, right? They're applauded in many ways for doing it all, caring for the home, caring for other people at work, but they are literally not being compensated for it. They're not being recognized for it. And so it never amounts to even like a whiff of a narrative of any kind of heroism in any sort of way. You just do it and then fall down at the end of the day, and I think that that's why we need to be careful of these different tropes going on and how we're addressing the pandemic and how we're talking about it and the ways that we're using this language of look at her go, or like that person's a hero, when for a while we were talking about maybe calling those front care workers victims instead of heroes. That nurse is a victim of the pandemic. I mean, that's something to at least consider in a way. Or the person working at that grocery store is a victim, victim, hero, and so on. But this idea of the invisibility of one's position not ever being fully recognized, let alone compensated or belonging, I think that's another theme running through all of these comments.
Yeah, there was a really interesting dichotomy from the open-ended responses where the word hero really over time started to just not resonate. Yet they also, nurses would talk about, but it is actually good to finally be recognized for what we do for society. So it was this very odd kind of two sides of a coin that, depending on how they were doing that day, was either rewarding and uplifting or demoralizing, depending on really like what else was going on and how their day was going and how their mental health was that day. So it was very compelling to read the transcripts and the comments.
Are there any more questions in the live chat?
Question. Oh, sorry. No, but I can formulate a question, if you allow me to. So one of the things that motivated this discussion series is, or one of the questions that motivated this discussion series, and now that we're talking about tropes, one of the things that I was very interested was about how sort of we, in the case of immigrants, for example, people of color, the way in which we relate to people is in terms of tropes such as criminalization, right? So we see immigrants, or at least the way in which we have sort of rhetorically and in terms of the media, the way in which we portray these people, and also African American men, et cetera, is in terms of as criminals. But I started wondering if perhaps the trope of health and hygiene may be also contributing to the way in which we are racializing people of color generally, but also immigrants. At the last panel, we talked about the way in which, for example, the Biden administration is deporting immigrants, and how this is exacerbating the way in which immigrants are dealing with COVID-19. And so this might loop into not only are we sort of excluding them, but also perhaps we're creating a new trope in which we are relating to immigrants and people of color more generally. So just feel free to jump onto this comment.
Yeah, I mean, so as the historian, it's my job to plant the flag and say that none of this is new, unfortunately. And so, here I refer to, again, I think I mentioned her earlier, but the historian Natalia Molina, who has done fantastic research detailing the medicalization of immigration narratives, and specifically kind of the creation of this idea of the dirty Mexican and kind of its reverberations across the 20th century, right? And so it has so many obvious effects, right? In the 1920s, when Congress was passing laws to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they left the door open to Mexico. One of the reasons they did so is because agriculturalists demanded a continued source of labor for their cheap and backbreaking labor. And here Mexicans were portrayed as being naturally capable of doing stoop labor, of standing under the sun, and of doing this work on hours on end. And not only that, they were also often called birds of passage, that they would be like geese that would come up to work in the United States, and then when their jobs were done, they would just migrate naturally back to Mexico, right? And so we see that kind of across the 20th century in different ways in which Latinx workers and undocumented workers and workers with kind of tenuous hold on documentation status in this country have not only been kind of buffeted into those positions, but the justification for that type of treatment have often fallen within kind of this idea that they're naturally susceptible to and naturally capable of doing this work because of some sort of, racialized understanding of their capacity.
Last, we have a comment from Amber Wichowski, who says, yes, hero is the rhetorical inverse of the invisible worker. Neither afforded help or recognition. Thank you, B.
I should hasten to say that I don't want to kind of like equate their material conditions because they're really, really different. Just want to put that out there.
No, but it's funny because, not that their material conditions are equated, but I've sort of wondered, what is the version of the economy, or for that matter, the public health quote unquote system that if you were to make a diorama of it, right? What would that fictional version look like, right? You'd have the lone heroic worker, but there would be tons of workers that simply aren't depicted whatsoever. And then there would be these, in a sense, kind of magical ways in which public health is protected. I mean, it's sort of interesting to me how the wide tolerance for infantilization that we have surrounding, the way in which we're told that the economy exists and the public health system exists. It's sort of fascinating to me.
We have one more comment from Dr. Alexander Martins from the Theology and Nursing Department in San Marquette. He says, I never totally got why people refer to certain individuals as heroes in the US. Sometimes this excuses leaders from doing social actions that can impact on people's lives.
I mean, I can jump in with that. Like, I think one reason that hero is a category that we're especially attached to is because there is a literary term in Latin which translates in English to the translation of empires, and empires over the world have consistently justified themselves by saying we're like the new version of this old empire. So Britain in the 19th century, while it was colonizing the world, liked to see itself as the new version of Rome. America likes to see itself as the new version of, I mean, we pretend not to do this because rhetorically we like to distance ourselves from Britain, but we do see ourselves as the kind of still ascended world empire and get very butthurt anytime anybody challenges our status. Like, and yeah, we should start closing the conversation now. But heroism goes along with the discourse of empire. Those two things are linked. And I think that one reason we prize heroes as cultural figures is because we see ourselves still as the empire who is always going to be on the right side of history. And so many other terrible things flow from that. That's oversimplified, but we need to close off because it's 6:31. So I will say thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. That was a fantastic discussion. I feel like I learned so much just from sitting here listening to you. Really, really fabulous. Please give yourselves a round of applause because we don't have a physical audience here, but thank you all so, so much. And Jorge, thank you so much for putting this series together. Really fantastic work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tune up and check us out on the Center for the Advancement of the Humanities. On YouTube, you can find the other COVID-19 panels. So check us out there. Like us on Twitter, Facebook. And thank you so much, everyone. It was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Jorge, and all.
Thank you, everyone. Have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful evening.
Great panel.
Thanks, everybody.